She's between things right now, my sister told her mother-in-law, her voice carrying clearly through the half-open kitchen door. I was standing in the hallway of her house, with a hand-quilted baby blanket under one arm and a gift bag hanging from my wrist, still in my scrubs from a 12-hour shift. Close enough to hear every word, and far enough that nobody had spotted me yet. She stays with Mom and Dad on and off. I don't really know what the plan is. Honestly, some people just take longer to figure themselves out. Somebody made a soft, sympathetic sound, the kind people make when they don't know they're supposed to feel something harder. I stood there a moment and let it sit with me, the way I let things sit when I'm deciding what to do with them. Then I pushed the door open. "Hey," I said, "sorry I'm late, shift ran long." My sister's face did that thing it does, a flash of something she immediately organized into warmth. She crossed the kitchen and hugged me before I'd even set anything down, her arms wrapping around the gift bag and the quilt and everything else, and said my name the way she always does, when she's relieved. I showed up and hoping I didn't hear what she just said. Both things were true. The woman in the gray cashmere cardigan, standing near the refrigerator, was my brother-in-law's mother, Dr. Miriam. She was 64, recently retired from a 30-year cardiology practice, and she had the kind of stillness that comes from a career spent reading situations quickly and reacting to none of them prematurely. She looked at me the way you look at someone you've already been given a summary of. Polite, measured, already decided. "You must be Thea's sister," she said. "I am." I set the gift bag on the counter. "Cleo, nice to finally meet you." She shook my hand. Her grip was firm in the specific unhurried way that surgeons and ER nurses share, neither of us proving anything, just making contact. Her eyes dropped for just a second to the back of my right hand, to the flat, discolored patch of skin that runs from my knuckle almost to my wrist, where a cleaning solution had splashed 18 months ago, during a psych hold that went sideways. She looked at it the way someone looks at something they recognize but aren't ready to uses but aren't ready to name yet. "So lovely," she said, and the moment passed. My sister steered me toward the living room with a hand on my elbow, already talking about the centerpieces, and I let her because that's the kind of thing I've gotten good at. Moving through a moment without letting it become a scene. It doesn't need to be. I have to back up. My name is Cleo, and I'm 32 years old, and for the past 2 years, my sister has been telling people in her orbit, her husband's family, the neighbors, the women she does yoga with on Tuesday mornings, that I'm going through a rough patch, that I'm between things, that I lean on our parents. None of that is true, not one word of it. I'm a charge nurse in the emergency department at Kellerman Regional Medical Center, which is a level I trauma center 40 minutes from the town where my sister and her husband bought their house 2 years ago. I have a 2-bedroom apartment with a lease I signed myself. I have a 4-grade 1A, a 10-year-old car I keep in good shape, and a schedule that runs predominantly nights, which means I'm frequently absent from the afternoon events that populate my sister's social life, and that absence, somewhere along the way, became the raw material she used to build a version of me she found easier to explain. This is how stories like that get started. Someone asks a simple question, "Where's your sister?" And you're tired, or distracted, or a little embarrassed that the answer involves night shifts and 12-hour stretches and a job that's hard to describe to people who don't work in medicine, and so you reach for the simpler version. The version that doesn't require the other person to understand anything complicated. She's in a bit of a transition right now. She's finding her footing. The problem isn't the first time you say it. The problem is the 10th, the 20th. The problem is that by the time you've told that story to your in-laws and your neighborhood friends, and the book club you joined last spring, it has calcified into something you've stopped noticing is untrue. I think about how it started and I always land on the same 8-month stretch 2 years ago. I'd taken medical leave from my unit, not the kind people take because they can't handle the work, but the kind where your right wrist has been slowly giving out for 3 years from the repetitive motion of charting and IV placements, and finally a hand surgeon looks at the MRI and says, gently, that it's time to deal with it before the damage becomes permanent. I had the surgery. I needed 6 weeks of limited duty, and my parents live closer to the specialist managing my post-op care, so I stayed in my old bedroom for 49 days. 49 days, during which my sister came by twice with takeout and a sympathy that felt genuine and warm. Except that wasn't that, because somewhere in those 49 days, Thea had found the version of the story she wanted to keep. I went back to full duty. I signed my apartment lease. I started working nights again, covering the shifts nobody else wants because they're brutal and they pay better, and I've always done my best work in the particular quiet of a trauma bay at 3 a.m., when everything depends on staying steady. My sister, apparently, did not update the story she'd been telling. The first time I heard it was at our parents' house, 6 months after I'd moved back out, at Sunday dinner. One of my mother's friends asked how I was settling in at home. I said I wasn't, that I'd had my own place for months, and my sister laughed in the way she laughs when she wants to make something smaller than it is. She said she always gets my timeline confused. She turned back to the other woman and changed the subject. My mother smoothed her napkin in her lap and said nothing. My father asked if anyone wanted more roasted potatoes. I sat there with my fork in my hand and understood something that took me a moment to fully name. This wasn't confusion. Confusion gets corrected the second time it surfaces. Out of embarrassment, if nothing else. What I was watching was a story that had been found useful, and useful stories don't get corrected on their own. They just keep getting told. The second time I heard it was worse, because it came with a price tag. 8 months before my sister's baby shower, she called me on a Tuesday evening, and I could hear, before she'd said 5 words, that she was working up to something. She had that voice, careful, slightly too light, the voice she uses when she's about to ask for something. She doesn't know how to ask for directly. She'd found the nursery furniture she wanted, a crib and dresser from a small furniture maker upstate, solid wood, the kind of thing that lasts through multiple children and decades of use. The total was $4,800. She'd already put $2,000 down. The remaining $2,800 needed to be paid by the end of the week to hold the order, and her savings were tied up in a joint account she and my brother-in-law were keeping for a refinancing. I'd ask Mom and Dad, she said, and I could hear her choosing her words carefully, but they've already done so much for us with the move, and I don't want to make it into a whole thing. And I can't really ask Hugo's mother, because she'll have opinions about the furniture, and then it becomes her furniture, if you know what I mean. I knew what she meant. Send me the invoice, I said. I wired $2,800 that Thursday morning, standing in my kitchen before a run, watching the confirmation number appear on my banking app. I didn't tell our parents. I didn't tell my closest friend Lena, which I later regretted, because Lena would have said something true and necessary that I wasn't ready to hear yet. My sister texted a heart and a thank you. That was it. No timeline mentioned, no mention of it at the next family dinner or the one after that. The furniture arrived. The nursery got decorated. The baby shower invitations went out 3 weeks later. I'm telling you all of this because you need to understand what was under my arm. When I walked through that door and heard my sister describe me as someone who hasn't figured out her plan yet, I'd spent 4 months making a quilt out of fabric. My grandmother had saved from her own projects over 40 years. Scraps of cotton and linen and one piece of a green floral dress my grandmother wore in photographs from the 1970s, hand-stitched into a pattern I learned from a YouTube tutorial at 11 at night after 12-hour shifts bent over my kitchen table with my repaired wrist aching in the way it does when I've pushed it a little too far. That's what I was carrying when I walked in. Comment A if you think I should have said something right then, put the quilt on the counter, and corrected the story my sister had just told in front of everyone. Comment B if you think staying quiet, like I did, was the right call. I'll tell you what I actually chose before this is over. I stayed quiet. I went into the living room and helped arrange the napkins into fans, the way the party planner had diagrammed in a little printed guide on the kitchen table. I set out the small favors in their tissue-wrapped boxes, and smiled when my sister's friends introduced themselves and asked how I knew the mother-to-be. She's my sister, I said, and watched them recalibrate visibly, in the direction of whatever story they'd been told. before settling into pleasant small talk about the baby's name and the nursery color, and whether the shower cake was fondant or buttercream. Dr. Miriam was the one person at that shower who didn't make small talk. She sat near the window with a glass of sparkling water and watched the room with the kind of attention that comes from decades of reading patients. Reading what they're not saying as carefully as what they are. She watched me in particular. I noticed, but not unkindly. There was something in her expression I couldn't quite place. Familiarity, almost. The kind of look someone gives when they're trying to place a face they've seen somewhere else. The quilt came out when my sister opened gifts. She peeled back the tissue paper and went still, hands hovering over the fabric, and I saw her actually look at it. Really look, not the polite glance you give a handmade gift before setting it aside. She recognized the green floral piece from the old photographs. She touched it, one finger running along the seam, and when she looked up at me, her eyes were wet, in a way she clearly hadn't planned on. "You made this," she said. "You and the baby needed something of Grandma's in the nursery," I said. "Now you have it." She didn't say anything for a moment, and the room was doing that thing rooms do when something real has happened in the middle of a planned event. Everyone slightly suspended, waiting for cues about how to respond. "This took you forever," she said, quiet. 4 months, I said, but I had time. What none of them knew was what I meant by that, what the 4 months actually looked like. The nights I came home from 12-hour shifts and sat down at the kitchen table anyway because I'd promised myself I'd finish at least 2 rows before I slept. The Tuesday, I stayed up until 2 a.m., fixing a seam I'd measured wrong. The way my wrist felt about all of it, which was not enthusiastic, but which I ignored, because some things you finish in spite of the discomfort, because the discomfort isn't the point. Dr. Miriam was watching me when I said it. I noticed her looking at the quilt, then at my hands, then at the burn scar on the back of my right hand, and something in her expression shifted the way it had when we first shook hands, a recognition she wasn't yet ready to voice. What I didn't know was that in about 40 minutes, while my sister was opening the last of her gifts, and someone was refilling mimosas, Dr. Miriam was going to pull my brother-in-law aside, and in about 90 minutes at the brunch table that followed the gift opening, Hugo was going to stand up without any prepared remarks and say something that would change the shape of my family more than anything had in the past 2 years. But I didn't know that yet. I sat at the table and ate a small plate of fruit and answered questions about what kind of work I did in a way that was honest but brief. The way I always talk about my job in social settings, where the full truth would make people put down their forks. It was Dr. Miriam who finally asked the question directly. We were at the far end of the table, the two of us, after the gifts and before the cake, and she turned to me with her sparkling water and said, without preamble, "Kellerman Regional. That's where you work, isn't it?" I went still for just a second. "Yes, I'm a charge nurse there." She nodded, the nod of someone confirming something they'd already suspected. "I knew I recognized you. 8 months ago, February, my husband came in by ambulance. Chest pain," the paramedic said, "possible cardiac event." I remembered. Not all patients stay with you, but some do. The man who'd come in during a February night shift, 67 years old, initial presentation that looked textbook, and then something off in the second set of vitals that the attending had been about to attribute to anxiety. Me standing at the workstation with the chart on the screen thinking, no, the troponin isn't right. The rhythm isn't right. I'd flagged it. We'd run additional imaging. The attending had been frustrated with me for approximately 45 minutes, and then, grateful in the specific quiet way attendings are grateful when a nurse turns out to have been correct. "Your husband was discharged after 3 days," I said. "He did well." "He's playing golf again," she said, which I consider both a sign of good health and a personal inconvenience. The joke landed dry and genuine. Then she went quiet. The attending told me later, when I asked directly, that the charge nurse on that shift flagged something in the imaging he had been about to attribute to incidental findings. She looked at me. "That was you." It wasn't a question. "We have a good team," I said, which was the answer I always gave, the one that moved the spotlight off me before it could settle. She looked at me for a moment and then said, quiet and direct. My daughter-in-law described you this morning as someone who hasn't found her footing yet. The table noise continued around us. Someone laughed at something near the cake. My sister was talking to her college friend about nursery paint colors. I know, I said. I'm going to ask you something I probably have no business asking, Dr. Miriam said. When my husband came in that knew he was. Did you know whose family you were treating? I didn't know who he was, I said. He was a patient. That's the whole job. Everyone who comes through those doors is just a patient. She sat with that for a moment. Then she said, then I owe you something I haven't had the chance to give you. And I don't think I'm going to sleep well if I let today pass without saying it. She looked at me directly. Thank you for doing your job exactly as well as it needed to be done, on a February night when you had no idea who was lying in that bed, or who loved him. I nodded. The back of my throat had gone tight in a way I hadn't expected. I'm also, she said, going to have a conversation with my son. She didn't elaborate. She picked up her sparkling water and turned back to the table, and I sat with what had just happened and tried to figure out what it meant and couldn't quite get there. Hugo stood up at the brunch table 40 minutes later with nothing in his hands. No phone, no note. He'd been in the hallway with his mother for about 10 minutes, and when he came back to the tables and stood up without sitting down, the room went quiet the way rooms do when someone stands without warning. Attention collecting from all directions at once. I want to say something, he said, looking at my sister first, then at me, then out across the table at the 10 people gathered there. I'm going to ask everyone to forgive me if it comes out wrong, because I'm working from something I just learned about 15 minutes ago. My sister's hand went still on her water glass. I've been hearing about Cleo for 2 years, Hugo said, since I first started getting serious with Thea. I heard she was going through a hard time, that she was staying with her parents a lot, that she was still working things out. He paused, and his voice stayed even, not angry, just steady and unhurried. That version of Cleo is not who's sitting at this table. The room had gone completely quiet. My mother was at Kellerman Regional in February, he said, the night my father came in with a cardiac event that turned out to be more serious than the initial read suggested. It was Cleo who flagged the secondary presentation. It was Cleo who stood at that chart and said something isn't right here and didn't let it go until someone listened. My father is here. He's healthy. And a significant part of the reason that's true is the charge nurse who was working that shift and paid attention when paying attention was the whole job. He looked at my sister, and his voice stayed gentle, but it did not waver. My wife has been describing her sister as someone who struggles to take care of herself. But Cleo took care of my father on a night she had no reason to give anything extra. And she did it without knowing who he was, or who would eventually sit at a table like this, and have to explain the difference between the story they'd been told and the one that was actually true. My sister had gone white beside him, her hands were in her lap, and she was not moving. There's something else, Hugo said. He looked at me directly. My mother asked me, when she told me all of this, whether I'd known, whether anyone had told me the real version. He stopped for a moment. Nobody had. I'd been repeating the wrong one without knowing it. So I'm not standing up here to make anyone feel bad. I'm standing up here because the truth is sitting right there at the end of the table, and I don't think it should have to keep waiting in line behind a story that was never true. He raised his water glass, didn't drink, just raised it toward me. The blanket Cleo made for our baby took 4 months, he said. My wife just found out. I want it on record that I know it now too, and I'm not going to forget it. Nobody moved for a moment. And then Dr. Miriam raised her glass quietly, and the woman beside her followed. And it spread around the table the way things spread when someone finally says what the room has been quietly waiting to hear. I sat there, with my hands folded in my lap, and did not cry, though something in my chest had come loose and was doing something embarrassing in the vicinity of my throat. And I did not say a single word in my own defense, because for the first time since that Sunday dinner with the roasted potatoes, I did not have to. My sister found me near my car at the end of the afternoon. She'd held it together through the rest of the brunch, the way she holds things together. When she's decided, she's not going to fall apart in front of an audience. But now, it was just the two of us in the driveway. And her eyes were red in a way that told me she'd spent at least 20 minutes in the bathroom, while I was helping carry things to the recycling bin. "I don't know how to start," she said. "You don't have to figure that out right now," I said. "Yes, I do." She set the paper plate of leftover cake she'd inexplicably grabbed on the hood of my car and looked at me directly. "I built a story. I know I did. It started because I didn't know how to explain the leave and the surgery, and you being home without making it sound like something had gone wrong. And then I just kept telling it because it was already out there. And correcting it felt like it would make me look worse than leaving it alone." "It did make you look worse," I said, "leaving it alone. Just eventually." She flinched, the way she does when something lands exactly where she knew it was going to. "The money," she said. "The money," I said. "I'm going to pay you back. All $2,800. More, actually. I'm going to figure out what I would have paid in interest to a bank and I'm going to add it, and I'm going to have it in your account before the end of next week. Hugo already knows. I told him while you were helping carry the chairs." She stopped, swallowed. He was not thrilled. "He seems like someone who doesn't like incomplete information," I said. "He is exactly that kind of person," she said, and her voice cracked slightly, which is probably why he stood up at a baby shower and gave a speech I will never stop being grateful for and never stop being embarrassed by for the rest of my life. We stood there for a moment in the driveway, with the sound of someone's lawnmower, 3 houses down, and the late afternoon light going golden across the car hoods. "I want to know you," my sister said, quieter now. "The actual version. Not the one I made up because it was easier to carry than the truth. I want to know what the ER is actually like. I want to know what happened to your hand. I want to know what February was like for you, working that shift, not knowing whose father was in that bed." She pressed her lips together. "I've had 2 years to learn any of that, and I didn't ask. And I want to start asking, if you'll let me." "We have time," I said. "You're not going anywhere." "Neither are you," she said. "That's the whole point." She picked the cake plate off my car hood, looked at it like she'd forgotten she was holding it, and laughed a little. The first real laugh of the afternoon, unguarded and a little wet at the edges, the kind that happens when the performance is finally over and there's nothing left but the actual people. The money arrived 6 days later, $200, the principal plus what she'd calculated as a reasonable rate over the months, which was more than I'd expected. She texted before it hit my account. The text said, "Paid in full," and I mean every version of that. I'm sorry it took so long for the truth to find the right room. I sat with that text for a long time. Lena, who is my closest friend and an ER nurse who had been following this situation with the steady, exasperated attention she applies to everything, said when I finally told her. "It took a retired cardiologist and your sister's husband to say out loud what I have been trying to tell you for 8 months. You were telling me to confront her," I said. "That's not the same thing." "It would have gotten there faster," she said. "It would have gotten there messier," I said. This way she had to hear it from someone she couldn't dismiss. "If it came from me, it's a grievance. If it comes from Hugo, it's just the truth." Lena was quiet for a moment, then said, in the grudging way she acknowledges things she doesn't fully want to agree with, "Fine. But I'm logging this as a win for letting things find their own moment." "Log it however you want," I said. "The outcome's the same." The outcome, 2 months out, is that my sister calls me now. Not texts, calls. She asks real questions. She asked about the worst shift I've ever worked, and I told her more of the truth than I've told most people outside the department. She asked about the hand, and I explained what a psychiatric hold can look like at 3 a.m. And why the person who knocked the solution onto me was not, in any meaningful sense, a bad person. Just a person in crisis who didn't know where to put it. She listened in a way I didn't know she was capable of, because I'd never given her the chance to try. Dr. Miriam had me to dinner 6 weeks after the shower. Just her and her husband and Hugo and my sister and me. Nothing formal, pasta from a recipe she'd been making for 30 years. Her husband asked me over salad, in the direct way that people who've come through serious health events tend to become, what it felt like to be the person who caught the thing that could have been missed. I thought about it before I answered. I said it felt like doing the job the way the job is supposed to be done. Not heroic. Just correct. Just paying attention when paying attention was the entire requirement. He looked at me for a moment and said, "I've wanted to thank you in person since February. I didn't know how to find you." "You found me," I said. "Just took a different route than expected." His wife smiled into her pasta. Hugo refilled my water glass without being asked. My sister, across the table, was watching me with an expression I'd seen for the first time at the shower, not the performance of sisterhood, but the actual thing, which is smaller and quieter and infinitely harder to sustain, and infinitely more worth it. I think about the sequence of it sometimes. How close it came to just never happening. If Dr. Miriam hadn't been at Kellerman that February night, if she hadn't recognized me, if the scar on my hand hadn't caught her eye across a baby shower brunch table, the whole shape of it depended on a detail nobody planned. A coincidence that turned out not to be a coincidence at all. Just the truth, patient and unhurried, waiting for the right set of eyes to finally look at it directly. Lena asked me once, late in a night shift, coffee going cold at the nurse's station, whether I wished I'd said something myself, sooner, more directly. I told her what I still believe, which is this: some truths don't land the same way when they come from the person who's been carrying them. They carry the weight of the grievance, and people spend more time deciding how to receive the messenger than actually hearing the message. When it came from Hugo, a man who loves my sister, who had no reason to say it except that it was simply true, it had nowhere to hide. It just sat in the middle of that brunch table and was exactly what it was. I didn't need a speech. I didn't need a dramatic moment. I needed one person to look past the story they'd been handed and say what they actually saw. That's all it ever was, the simplest thing, and somehow the rarest one. The quilt is in the nursery now. My sister sent me a photo last week. Afternoon light, coming through yellow curtains, and the quilt folded over the crib rail, with the green floral piece from my grandmother's dress turned toward the camera, like she knew I'd want to see it specifically. I saved the photo and went back to work, and that was more than enough.